Welcome to a special video edition of the Hauger History Podcast with me, Mr. Hauger. I am the second part, which I think was clear when I pointed at myself. This is episode 39, a big one. We're talking about the Civil War and hopefully giving you some visualizations to help you understand some of the larger concepts. And one of the first things that I want to just take a minute to discuss before we even get into specifics is that you're probably going to learn that there is a difference in perspective based on anything you learn because of who and where you learn it. And the difference in perspectives about the causes and looking back at the Civil War will vary. I found very specific contrast between the things I learned from the University of Houston's website about the Civil War and teaching it to middle schoolers, and what I see in the San Francisco Public Unified Districts here in California. Each one takes a different juxtaposition about how the origins of the Civil War started. What was the fighting about? And if there were good guys and bad guys, and most of the time it's most important to point out that 620,000 Americans lost their lives, whether north or south. And we were fighting against family, brother against brother in some cases. And it was a very difficult and bloody conflict for everybody involved. But here's one example that I read on the Houston Education website, giving a first-person perspective, which we always like to analyze. They have robbed us of our property. They have murdered our citizens. They have set at naught the decrees of the Supreme Court. They have invaded our states and killed our citizens. They have declared their determination to exclude us altogether from the territories, and they have tapped this mighty pyramid of insults by electing Abraham Lincoln to the presidency on a platform and by a system which indicates nothing but subjugation of the South and the complete ruin of her social, political, and industrial institutions. Well, that certainly paints a picture about the invading northern enemy, doesn't it? And it's much different than the North that we think about freeing and emancipating slaves in a very heroic way. So just realize that the perspective that we are learning from will attempt to be neutral. However, in California, we're often taught that the North was fought for justification, and even though the South was fighting for states' rights, my takeaway is it was an awful fight on both sides, and it seemed it was going to be very difficult to have a resolution without, even though the UK and many other areas were able to sign into law declarations to end slavery without threatening a collapse of the Union. Well, with that, let's get right into it. Remember, you can send your questions at Hauger History on Twitter, subscribe at haugerhistory.podbean.com or on iTunes, and follow us all along the way on YouTube as well at the Danny Hauger YouTube channel. The fighting and devastation that took place was mostly in southern states. Robert E. Lee was actually desired by President Lincoln to be a general for the North, but how could that have changed the course of history? Because his brilliance in leading the South revitalized their efforts and kept their fight alive. President Lincoln thought a volunteer army would end this conflict very quickly from the start. He imagined that within 90 days, everybody could be home and the fighting would be over and the Union would be preserved. One of my favorite quotations will be paraphrased here, but what's often less talked about is that President Lincoln was willing to do whatever was necessary to preserve the Union, whether that meant freeing all the slaves or freeing none of the slaves. He just decided that a house divided amongst itself cannot stand, and that we needed to decide what kind of a nation we were going to be in order to be one nation. But President Lincoln's volunteer army of 90 days ran into early defeat because the Confederates were able to hold off at Fort Sumter and Bull Run and gain those early victories. And even 2 years into the war, it's said in the many sources that I looked at that neither side had a controlling hand on the war, which was expected by President Lincoln to be very short and unfortunately was not at all. Strategies of the Union and Confederate armies going into the war were simple. The Union were thinking of holding an anaconda plan, cutting off the access to water, trade, and reinforcements, and just putting a stranglehold on the South. It did not end up being easy at all. And the Southern economy was fighting at home. They thought King Cotton would be their biggest benefactor. We can get Europe involved. England and France, all of our European allies will come to our rescue because we have the cotton they so badly need. At the beginning of the war, failing to calculate that they had previously had a surplus in crop, sent so much to Europe that there wasn't a high demand, and Europe ended up staying neutral throughout the conflict. Technology of war improves during this time. Bullets fly farther, hollow points do more damage, and all weapons could be fired quicker. That meant that casualties would stack up even faster than they did in the American Revolution. Technology of war made things more deadly. Ironsides and ironclads battleships that could fight for 7 or 8 hours, receiving heavy fire and not be sunk. After the war, 10 times more warships existed than before. So this propelled the country forward in their naval endeavors. And twice as many people died of disease as they did from battle wounds. People didn't know anything about germs or sanitation. Doctors had no idea that you could transplant blood and have blood-borne diseases transplanted that way. People still weren't outfitted properly. Was so long after the American Revolution that no one was trained to fight once again. Few people were outfitted. You've got frozen feet on frozen ground, cut and bloody, getting the worst hygiene possible, carrying a toothbrush for 5 or 6 people, brushing once or twice a week, and things were not good at all. A small wound could be festered and could mean the end of your life if not treated and not treated quickly, and there wasn't much treatment to be had out on the battlefield. The conflicts that were going on are well documented, and you can find a variety of sources, but the shots on Fort Sumter at the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, when they were running out of supplies, Lincoln had a tough decision to make whether to supply the garrison. He was risking war. He ordered the troops to leave the fort, and leaders of the Confederacy decided to prevent the federal government from holding on to the fort by attacking before supply ships would arrive. So Lincoln called out those 75,000 militiamen in 90 days, and they were unsuccessful in putting an end to the conflict. The middle states had a really tough time choosing sides. The border states of Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, they were slave states that bordered the states in which slavery was illegal. But because of their location and resources, the border states could really tip the scales one towards another. And Maryland lawmakers backed the South initially, but decided against it ultimately. And you've got states that choose sides. Even California and Oregon were part of the Union, and fighting was taking place in Tennessee later on became important as well. The strengths and weaknesses, this is one of the things that wherever you're going to school or studying at whatever level is probably a subject of interest. The North had about 85% of the nation's factories. And that could mean also that factories could be repurposed to make bullets and guns, brandishments, and other ammunitions that were needed. The North had more than double the railroad. If you need to move supplies from one area to the next, railroad was the way you were going to do it at the time. Also, about 2 to 1 in terms of people, and the North had a remarkable leader in President Abraham Lincoln, who was only elected with 40% of the popular vote and had an immense challenge on his hands. But the North had supply lines, 71% of the U.S. population, 71% of the U.S. railroads, 85% of the manufacturing plants, and more than 90% of all of the industrial workers. Their Anaconda plan to blockade the South and force people to starve, basically, of supplies was one that was thought that could have been successful, but the leaderships and military genius of the South and the Confederates were amazing. The victories at Bull Run and Fort Sumter, they forced Lincoln to call 500,000 real soldiers to get involved in the conflict, which was escalating very quickly, and showed that life in the Army was not going to be easy. They recruited some people based on excitement. People who were farmers made up the largest portion of the fighters, and a lot of them were just looking to get away from the farm and see some excitement, see some energy. Some of them were really enticed by the chance to take a train trip for the first time. Think about that. A train trip leading to 4 years of fighting if you were able to make it through. It was brutal. Those that fought ranged from 18 years to 32 years of age. Those are all really good words to put together, aren't they? Especially when I'm cramming and looking for something at the same time. But there was a great deal of difficulty going through these times. General McClellan was removed because he failed to close off the Confederates in the South. Ulysses S. Grant comes in to be the captain and commander of the Union Army. And Grant made a bold move to take Tennessee. Using ironclad gunboats, Grant's forces captured 2 Confederate river forts. The seizure of Fort Henry opened up a river highway into the heart of the South. Union gunboats could now travel as far as northern Alabama. When the people of Tennessee heard the forts were lost, they fled the city in panic, and a week later, Union troops marched onto Nashville. There were still more fighting that needed to occur. The war was far from over then, but that gives you some ideas of the situation in which the United States found itself in the midst of civil war. Have specific questions, leave them below in the comment section, and I'll be glad to post responses and possibly make a part 2 to this video and post that in the conclusion as we move further into American history, the development of the nation's identity, and the country that became what it is today. This has been the Hauger History Podcast with Mr. Hauger. I have been. The second part, please follow, subscribe, and we'll see you on the next edition of the Hauger History Podcast. Thanks a lot for listening, everybody, and we will see you next time.